So now that we've already gone through some specific neuroanatomy and start to understand the two automatic processes that happen within our body, the fight or flight response. For this conversation's sake, the amygdala is our focused neuroanatomy, and then the prefrontal cortex for the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest, digest, develop, and heal mode. So the question then is, how can we define health? Because over the last 3 years, the conversation has gotten very, very confusing, because a healthy person could then get COVID and then die, or if with the increase in cancer rates and cardiovascular rates, mental illness. A common thing that I've heard over and over now is, yeah, they were so healthy until they got cancer and died. They were so healthy until they had a heart attack and died. They were so healthy until they had a complete mental breakdown. And so to me, I think it deserves a lot of conversation, because obviously we're missing something. Because if someone has a condition that is preventable, and then that condition then kills them, they didn't become unhealthy the moment they got the diagnosis. Something else had to have been going on in order to then lead them to the place where they were then died from this condition. And so the question, what is health? Health. And understanding the fight or flight response stops the process from resting, digesting, developing, and adapting, healing. But the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest, digest, develop, heal pathway, we don't challenge our bodies, and therefore we then become weaker. So my brother Davis, he moved across the world to live in the jungles of the Dominican Republic, right here at Symmetry Oasis. And we're going to dive into his story in subsequent modules and how he got here. But let's just say that it was a little bit of a culture shock from living in Washington State, living with my dad and his wife, to living in a jungle on a mountain. And Davis's thoughts, I think, best define health.
This little thing scared the crap out of me as it came charging out to eat up a little moth. And of course, since I just sprayed a giant spider, I thought it was a gigantic spider flying at me. So yeah, this place is part relaxation and part terror.
There we go. There we have it. That, as far as my understanding of neuroanatomy, is the best definition of health. Part relaxation, part terror, in equivocal amounts, meaning part fight or flight response, get us engaged, get us challenged, and then part relaxation in order to heal and then adapt from that challenge. And then, so when we go into then, identifying, well, where is everyone at in the spectrum of this balance? We do not yet have the technology to analyze neuroanatomy to the depth that is necessary to really come up with a solid, objective, measurable piece of data. However, we do have EEG machines, which we have one here at Symmetry Oasis, and you can measure electrical activity within the brain. And we've been able to measure these stress patterns with that electrical activity. But for me, I think we have a lot more research to do and a lot more data to collect to come up with a very quantifiable way to see, okay, how much anatomy is strengthened within the amygdala and how much anatomy is strengthened or engaged within the prefrontal cortex, because that's that balance in between them, that symmetry between them, then is the perfect combination between challenge and challenge accepted, and strength and adaptation, if that makes sense. So if we could break it down, based on our conversation up to this point, I think we could conclude that the majority of humans that were alive since 2020 forward in developed worlds have a strengthened amygdala, meaning they had a good amount of stress, of change within their lives, and toxicity, increase in technology time for sure, and inactivity that then all strengthen that amygdala. So that amygdala is super strong. So, and to give you an idea, there is a common belief system that when we have a running narrative in our mind, when we're thinking in words and having a conversation, in and for me and from the conversations I've had, it seems the majority of those conversations are typically negative. I mean, oh, can you believe that guy? What he just said? Oh my gosh, my boss! I can't believe they would talk to me that way. And for me, when I understand the neuroanatomy, that doesn't seem like a smart part of our brain, although it's trying to convince us that it is smart, right? I have every reason to be upset. I have every reason to be anxious. I have every reason to be fearful. And for me, what I believe that's the amygdala. I believe that is our warrior part of our brain, that reptile, that very primitive part of the brain, that amygdala that is trying to find the lions, as we talked about earlier on in the first module. It's trying to identify the lions, so it's convincing us that the dangers are real and we need to focus on them. And however, that is not our super fast, smart part of our brain. The orbital lateral prefrontal cortex. That prefrontal cortex is our super deductive reasoning, fast executive function, solve problems before you even know that the problem exists. Part of our brain, the part of our brain that's faster than any supercomputer. The prefrontal cortex, I believe, supersedes thought, supersedes cognition, supersedes a language that then we run within our mind. So, and if you could analyze the course of the day, how much a running dialogue is going on versus how much is just a simple knowing, a simple piece and a processing in that flow state, and that would give us an awareness of how much work is needed to be done as far as decreasing the noise from the amygdala and then stimulating the orbitolateral prefrontal cortex. And I bring up the orbitolateral prefrontal cortex specifically because I think that's a specific part of neuroanatomy that has been affected over the last 3 years of the pandemic. One of my friends during the pandemic, she said to me one day, she goes, have you noticed how when someone has a mask on, oftentimes they'll pull the mask away from their face in order to listen? Did you remember that? It's been a bit since the mask mandates have been in effect. But and I started to pay attention when, at the coffee stand or even watching people have conversations, they pull their mask away, in essence negating the perceived benefit of the fabric in order to listen, and they lean in, right? Oops. And so, for me, I like to dissect, why is that, right? And during the pandemic, it got very weird because there became camps that were associated with political things, and the masking became a political thing, and people were either anti-mask or pro-mask, and for me, I simply wanted to understand, and I'm a naturalist and a purist, and I follow God's rules, so I made decisions based on my own belief system. But I wanted to understand, why would someone want to pull a mask away in order to then listen? And so I dove into the neuroanatomy involved in that, and it has to do with the vagus nerve, which we'll talk about in the vagus nerve section. But the second part of it has to do with the stress response in our brain. So when you have a decreased in prefrontal cortex activity and an increase in the amygdala because of stress, what happens is your brain actually downregulates auditory information. And it used to be a hunter. I used to go rifle hunting, and anyone who's fired a firearm, they're super loud. And you go to the firing range, and if you're doing practice target practice, you wear earmuffs in order, because it's such loud percussion with the firing of a weapon. And but then when I'm hunting, or when I used to hunt, and this is years ago, when you see the deer and you get the adrenaline response, and you're going to take when I was going to take a shot, I fire the weapon, and I couldn't hear it. I mean, it was faint. And it's because when you have an activation of that fight or flight response, the tympanums actually become more rigid in order to then deaden down sound. So this deadening down of sound then inhibits hearing. So there is a secondary response that happens within our neuroanatomy, that when you have stimulation of something that is artificial and constant, for example, wearing a shirt, your brain actually down regulates that response also. So you don't notice the shirt, right? It doesn't bother us having a shirt on. And the same thing happens with masking. You have a piece of fabric that's an artificial stimulation. It down regulates the vagus nerve, which directly impacts hearing also. So by pulling away the mask, now you've opened up that stimulation to the vagus nerve again and the facial nerve, which then opens up hearing. And that's one of the reasons why. So the second part of that is understanding the orbitolateral prefrontal cortex. The orbitolateral prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that does a couple things. It controls lateral eye movement and stimulates lateral eye movement. And I learned this with researching EMDR, rapid eye movement therapy. It's, from my research, it appears to be the most effective research for trauma. And what the guided counselors do is they have someone visualize a stressful situation maybe they had in the past, and then they would have them look back and forth in order to then stimulate that orbital-lateral prefrontal cortex. It starts to produce dopamine within the brain, serotonin, a sense of peace, and then it then neutralizes that stressful memory that that person is fixated on or reliving in their mind. So the orbital-lateral prefrontal cortex controls lateral eye movement. So now think about what movement we do with our phone all day long. It's up and down. So up and down motion is being reinforced, not lateral. However, reading a book, which even in my book that I'm releasing, that's going to accompany this program, the Christians Chiropractor's Guide to COVID Recovery. I'm doing it in a flip book manner, so people will be forced to read it laterally rather than up and down, and very intentionally, in order to help stimulate that orbital-lateral prefrontal cortex. So that lateral eye movement has been weakened, which then weakens the orbital-lateral prefrontal cortex. And then the second thing the orbital-lateral prefrontal cortex does and is worked with is recognizing and interpreting facial expressions. So, personally, I never wore facial coverings during the pandemic. However, I interacted with quite a few patients coming in that wore facial coverings. So the part of my brain that was used to interacting face to face with 100 people a day was all of a sudden no longer being worked because people's faces were now covered. My orbital-lateral prefrontal cortex didn't have the job that it used to have of interpreting facial expressions. That part of the brain became weaker. So based on just those couple observations societally, I would wager that the orbital-lateral prefrontal cortex has been significantly diminished or inhibited or atrophied, whatever term resonates most with you. So the emphasis is significant of decreasing the noise from the amygdala and stimulating the orbital-lateral prefrontal cortex. And wrapping our mind around just those 2 points. One part is very strong, one part is very weak. We know to focus with absolute intentionality in order to then go to point number 3, which is retraining the brain.